For this Photoshop Creative Cloud tutorial, we're going to take a look at using smart objects to selectively apply filters with layer masks. So we're in Photoshop. We've got this one layer open as a background. One of the first things I always like to do in Photoshop is to copy my background layer so I can retain the original image in case I want to go back to it or refer to it. So I'm just going to hit Command J on a Mac, which would also be Control J on a PC, and just turn off my background layer, and now I have a fresh layer that's a copy to work on with my edits. So a lot of people are probably familiar with filters. You have a menu which is just off screen here, but you can go up, click on filters, and we can apply a whole host of things. You know, for instance, if I wanted to go in and maybe do a smart sharpen, I can zoom into my image here, which is Command plus minus on a Mac, Control plus minus on a PC, and I can kind of see what effect this filter is having on my image. And keep in mind, this is applying it to the whole layer right now. So, you know, maybe you look at something like that and you say, okay, that looks pretty good, it's nice and sharp. Zoom back out, and if I wanted to go back and 10 steps later change this, I really can't, because the filter is now baked into this layer. So I'm just going to turn the background layer back on for a second here so we can see. Here's the layer we edited, turn off the visibility, here's the background layer. I can't really undo or change the amount of sharpening I apply to that layer. So rather than do that, I'm going to go ahead and delete this layer and make another copy of my original. We're going to take a look at how we can use smart objects to work with filters in a little bit better workflow here. So I can control click, or it's right click on a Windows, control click on a Mac, and under this layers menu I actually have convert to smart object. And it's going to basically wrap that original layer in something called a smart object, and it has this little symbol on it. If I double click on that layer, it's actually going to open up my original layer in a new tab. So this is where we started off working. I double clicked on it, and here's the original layer. So I could always go in and make changes to it and do different things to this, save them, and then those saves would show up inside of my smart object. So I'm just going to go ahead and close out the inside of this smart object, and that takes us back to our original document. So what's important for us is that we can combine smart objects with filters to make filters more flexible and allow them to do things that you normally would not be able to do with them. So my goal with this particular image in filters is to leave my subject and other things in the frame, such as the log, some of these details in the foreground, right up to about, you know, let's say these leaves and these roots, leave these kind of sharp, and then, you know, maybe blur out these branches and things that are out of focus but maybe look a little bit sharp, you know, these rocks and all that, and use a blurring filter to do that and leave the rest of the image sharp. So I've got my layer selected. I'm just going to turn off my background layer there. Go up to the filter menu and go to Gaussian blur. And so far everything looks pretty normal. We're just applying a filter to a layer. And what I'm interested in is blurring out this background enough, kind of fake this and make it look like we're using a super wide open aperture here. Which I probably was using something like 2.5, but we're going to go even more extreme here. And I clicked OK, and it looks like it applied it to the whole layer, which it did for now. But if we go back over to our layers panel, you'll notice that instead of just applying it to the smart object and kind of baking it in, the filter is actually separate. It's now a smart filter. And it has two parts to it. One is that I can go in and double click on the actual filter that I applied, and I can change the parameters of the filter. So it didn't actually bake them into the layer, it just kind of set them on top of the layer, and we can see the effects of it, but we can always go back in and change it. So if you need a little bit less blur, a little bit more blur, you can edit that as many times as you feel like. The second thing that it did is it added a layer mask which applies to the filters below it. So if you haven't used layer masks before, basically the way that they work is they're either painted white or black or any shade in between that. And whenever a layer mask is white, whatever effect is attached to it is going to show up 100%. So the effect that we currently have attached to it is this Gaussian blur, and since it is painted white across the whole entire image, so it's this vertical rectangle that's over top of the image, it's going to show up across the whole image. If I were to paint this whole thing black, so I'm going to go and grab my paint bucket tool, make sure I have my layer mask selected there, and I'm just going to paint it black, which is the color that I've selected right there. And you'll notice it looks like our blur disappeared for a whole layer, which according to the layer mask it did. If I want it to show back up, I can just switch back to white. I still have my paint bucket tool selected. I still have my layer mask selected. Paint the whole thing white, and now the Gaussian blur shows back up again. So my goal, as I said, was to blur the background while leaving the parts of the picture that were already sharp. So the way I'm going to work through this is I'm actually going to paint the whole image black, and then I'm going to select the part in the top half that I want to be blurry and paint it in, and then I'm going to do the same with the bottom half. So in order to do that, we want to make sure we have our layer mask selected, and I'm just going to use this Polygon Lasso tool to accomplish it for this particular image. And I have my tool selected, and something that you may not have noticed about your selection tools here is they actually have a property called feather. And essentially, whenever I go to make my selection, it's going to apply a little transition between where it's selected and where it's not selected if I have some feathering on there that will allow it to blend a little bit smoothly. So I'm just going to set maybe 8 pixels worth of feathering, and I'm going to go and select in the top half here the parts of the image that I actually do want to be blurry. So I'm going to go all the way around this log because we want that to stay sharp, but everything above it, other than our subject, needs to be blurry. So we're going to go around our subject, and I don't have to be super precise with this since I have that feathering applied. Kind of gives you a little bit of leeway, a little bit of wiggle room there. But I do want to make sure that I also don't go too far into the outline of my subject, otherwise I'll be blurring her a whole bunch. Okay. And you can always go back and select the areas under her arms here that need to stay blurry, but for our purposes I'm just going to kind of go around her in the log. And then I want to make sure I select the whole top half, so I'm just kind of going outside the canvas. And there we go. And I'm going to go back to my beginning point and finish off that shape. And if we zoom out, we can see our selection just covers the top half of the image that we want to be blurred. Now the reason I did that is I can more or less take this paint bucket tool now, and I can choose to paint this whole top half, and I actually want it to be white here. So I can either click right here to switch between my swatches, or I can hit the X key on the keyboard. My layer mask is selected, got my paint bucket tool, I got my white paint, and I'm going to paint it in, and if you zoom in you can see the whole background is blurred out now. And in order to deselect this selection, you can go up to the menu and do it under the select menu, or you can hit Control or Command D, and that will deselect my selection. And I've got a pretty good transition between the subject and the background already, just using that feathering. If we zoom in kind of close, you can see maybe that needs to be cleaned up a little bit, but I would say for a web image it would probably work really well. If you're going to print this photo, you might want to go back in and clean it up a little bit, but that's pretty good up top. So we can kind of repeat this process down here. So I still have my layer mask selected. I'm going to go in and select my Polygon Lasso tool, and I would say somewhere in here is probably where we want to keep it nice and sharp. starting right there. There we go. And I'm just going to kind of go around all the sharp stuff again, going down to about where these roots are. And we're going to do the same thing. All the way up into there. And I suppose, let's see, that's going to be blurred. Yeah, I need to come down this way, go over here, select all that. All right, so if we want to make this blurry, just want to make sure the layer mask is selected. Go back to our paint bucket, and we want to paint what's inside the selection white. And now we're getting blurred again. Which the transition between there and there is not very believable, but I'll show you a way here in a second that we can go in and clean that up. I'm just kind of looking to see if there's anything else in here that I want to blur out, which, I don't know, that's close enough to her that that looks pretty believable. So let's take care of this transition here and kind of make this a little bit more smooth. So in addition to using the paint bucket tool, you can also use just a regular brush to paint in your layer mask. And one of the keys to making this work well and getting a look that looks nice and polished is to change the opacity of your brush. So if you're starting off at 100% and you go in and just start painting white, you're going to get this hard edge, which is not what we want. So what I actually want to do is I'm going to drop this down to maybe 10%, and I'm going to change my color to black, and I'm going to start to sharpen some of that blurred image by painting black on that part of the layer mask, just to make our transition from sharp to blurred a little bit smoother. I'm just kind of feathering in this black, so it's more or less a light gray, I suppose, to make that happen. I could also go into where it's sharp, so I'm going to switch to white, and I'm actually going to make this a little bit blurry to help with that transition. Something like that, maybe. And it's very subtle because I'm at 10% opacity on this brush. But you're just kind of doing this to taste. I don't know, I kind of think this whole bottom should maybe be less blurry, so I'm going to make my brush way bigger. I'm going to do something like that. There we go. So as you can see, the layer mask is an extremely powerful thing. It allows you to go in and make some pretty precise edits, and the good news is you haven't destroyed any pixels on your actual image layer. So if you're not happy with your edits, or if you want to go back in and make little adjustments, you have the freedom to do so because the layer mask is more or less just kind of painting right on top of it. And just to give you a nice comparison here, so this is more or less where we ended up. I'm going to turn the background layer back on, turn everything that we've been working on off, kind of zoom in a little bit so we can see her in the background. And now let's turn our edited smart object with the filter back on. So as I said, you know, you might want to go in and clean up some of these edges a little bit, make this transition a little bit softer, but in a lot of these areas already we're starting to get some believable looking images here that is more or less faking a more out of focus background. So use that, you know, smart objects, use layer masks to kind of polish up your edits, selectively use your edits, and kind of take your Photoshop skills to the next level.